fáilte UHI, eiche ile cwrain caution, it's lovely to see so many of you tonight on what is a Michael night, and I think that's putting it mildly, to be perfectly honest. It's a night for sitting at the fire, but on the other hand, it's a good night to be here listening to you. I'm delighted that this is our second talk of our season. Last year we only managed one talk because of COVID restrictions. So this year we're doing well. This is our second talk of the winter. And I'm delighted to welcome Catriona Murray, who is a resident of North Tulsa, not from North Tulsa. And it's just great to have you here, Catriona. Catriona, as most of you know, is a lecturer at UHI Storey campus and lecturing on Gaelic and development and Gaelic language and culture, with a special interest, I would say, in oral history, folklore, through oral tradition. And you do deliver specific courses on the subject. And I've been noticing that Catriona has been very busy the last few weeks talking to people all over the island, as well in quite a few places. So it's brilliant to have you here tonight, Catriona. Some of you may be familiar with Catriona's column in the Monthly Record and also your blog. So a well-kent face of Warsaw. The subject tonight, as you'll have seen in the posters, is ghosts and the second sight. And it's a subject, or the wider subject is one that fascinates many of us. And I'm sure I'm not alone amongst you in having had many stories related over the decades, maybe more decades for me than for some of you, by family members and friends. I'm sure there might be some discussion afterwards. And with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Catriona. Would you like? Do you want to go behind? Do you need
a bit of safety? Yeah, they look like a rough crowd.
Oh, a very rough crowd.
I wouldn't mind. That would be lovely. I should have done this earlier. This isn't a thing for a respectable lady to be doing in front of an audience. But anyway, will that work for you? Is that okay? Fine. Good. Thank you. Well, I want to add my own thank you. My own welcome. It's ridiculous me welcoming you to your own community, but I'm really grateful so many of you have turned out tonight on what is, as Anna said, a Michaeler night. When I was asked to come, when Anna approached me first of all, she very kindly left it open to myself what I would speak about. And I was just saying to a couple of people a wee while ago, I toyed with a couple of subjects. I considered considered speaking about Bushnoch. I've never considered Bushnoch, despite living in Tulsa for so long. But for a number of reasons, I plumped for ghosts on the second sight, because I think primarily of all the folklore, and of all the supernatural folklore particularly, this is the one that dominates in Lewis, and I think in the wider Western Isles as well. I think it's fair to say that most reported or recorded incidents of supernatural activity relate to ghosts on the second sight. Some people think it's two topics in one, but it's not. In fact, a colleague said to me, "How long are you going to be speaking for?" And I said, "Oh, probably just the 3 or 4 hours." And nervous glances at the door. I said probably 45 minutes, that sort of in the order of that. And she said, "Wouldn't you be better doing one or the other then?" I said, "One or the other what?" And she said, "Ghosts or the second sight." Well, I said, it's one topic. And I think the fact that people do think that they're two separate topics speaks to something that we know has been happening anyway, that there's been a little bit of estrangement between us and our heritage. And because we don't talk about these things the way people used to talk about them. I mean, I'm not absolutely ancient, and even when I was a kid, people used to talk about na Gaelic, second sight, Taish and ghosts. They used to talk about bushnuch, witchcraft, all these kinds of things in a very easy way. It wasn't a contrived, we'll have a storytelling session. Because crucially, these things weren't stories anyway. They were yachtri, they were narrative, they were history. They were things that people related as if, in fact, they did believe that they had happened. It was from their own personal experience, or they were relating someone else's experience. But I think we've come to a place where we don't talk about it in that way as much anymore. And because of that, we don't understand it as well as maybe we did once upon a time. So, of all the ways that you can approach this very, very big subject, the way I've chosen, you'll be delighted to hear, is from a language and terminology direction. Starting with the word for ghost. In English we say ghost, in Gaelic we say taish. Now I'm sure if I had done a poll amongst you just now and asked you what's the Gaelic for ghost, those of you who have Gaelic would have said taish. And if I asked you what's the English for taish, you would say ghost. Fine, we can agree on that. What is a ghost? A ghost, again, I'm sure if I did a wee poll amongst you, you would come up with broadly the same answer. A ghost is the spirit of a dead person, someone who once lived in the world but is now no longer with us. And that's fine. Then consider the other part of our topic, second sight. What is second sight? Second sight is, on some level, it is the ability, whether it's passive or active, to foresee things that haven't yet happened, to see into the future on some level. And a word that was often used to describe people who had that facility was taishav. So you're coming up against a bit of an issue there with the language, because if taish means the spirit of a departed person, how can a taishav, a person who sees taishin, be seeing the future? The future surely has no truck with people who have already gone. And the reason, I think, and I think I can provide evidence for this, is that we're taking a really narrow, somewhat English language influenced view of what a taish is or what a taish was. My tenses will be all to pot. I'll be speaking in the past tense sometimes and in the present, but you know what I mean. Whether you still believe in them or don't believe in them or ever believed in them, you can decide for yourselves. But the word taish to us has come to mean the same as ghost means to people in the English monoglot world. But actually we have to park that idea and consider that in the Gaelic world, taish was really an umbrella term for a much broader spectrum of types of being, for want of a better description. So taish is the umbrella term. That took in, yes, spirits of the dead, but it also took in ghosts of the living, and it took in visions of the future. And when I say visions of the future, we know, and we'll come back to this point in a wee bit, we know, and I'm sure many of you know yourselves from having heard stories of the second sight, people didn't always literally see the future. They sometimes received information about the future in other ways. Sometimes it was visual, sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes it was auditory, and sometimes it was more mysterious even than that. So we'll come back to that point. There's actually a whole glossary, I suppose you could call it, of words relating to the Gaelic supernatural that has largely passed out of use. And there was a word that was used commonly for a spirit of the dead, other than taish, and the word is tanask. T-A-N-N-A-S-G, tanask. And that was used in the way that we now just lazily or ignorantly, or however you want to put it, the way we use Taish. It was always the traditional idea of the ghost, the visual of a person that has passed away. It might have been someone who'd passed away recently, but more often than not, the stories that we have on record relate to the ghosts of people who passed away some time ago. And quite a common feature of these stories is a word I really hate. It's a bit of an Americanism, but you hear it a lot nowadays. People talking about closure. Do you have closure in back? I don't know. We need to get closure when something traumatic has happened, or a big life event. People want to draw a line under it. And a lot of these stories that come to mind are in that category. So for example, probably a lot of you have heard about the Briasclet Mill ghost. The lady who reportedly used to haunt the Briasclet Mill when, I think it was in the 19th century, the Mill family were actually driven out by being troubled by her. And she was described as being dressed in the garb of maybe a century to a century and a half earlier, and with the elaborately dressed hair and all of that. Mill family moved out, continued to work the mill, and they had a young boy that used to watch the mill at night for them. Not an enviable job given the reason they had moved out. And he reported an encounter with her one night on the staircase of the mill, where she told him her story, and she told him that she and her brother had both been murdered for their money. And they had, whoever the robbers, the murderers were, they had got her brother's money, but not hers, because being a woman, she was smarter, and she had stashed it in her elaborate hairdo. And having told the boy the story, so the legend goes that she has not been seen since then, according to some people. So that's one. And there's another story which is interesting for two reasons. It's interesting because it seems to be that sort of idea of closure. There's a river near Avinsue, close to the border between Lewis and Harris. And the people in Avinsue, people in Harris generally didn't like going near there at night, because people had reported seeing an uncanny figure of a man who they knew wasn't real. So people didn't like to go there at night. But this particular day, 3 men from Lewis had to cross over to the Harris side. And this is where the man was always seen, the ghost was always seen. These 3 men had to cross. A man and his 2 sons, 2 grown-up sons. And one of the boys had an encounter with the ghost, and the ghost physically wrestled him and told him, when he had overpowered him, told him that he only wanted to tell him his story and to tell him where his bones were buried. He too had been killed. Told the boy where his bones had been buried, and the boy and some friends went to the spot that he had mentioned, apparently uncovered human remains, and nobody saw the ghost of the man hanging around the river after that. But I said that was interesting for 2 reasons. So one, as I said, it's another example of that kind of story. But the other thing is, the old people used to believe that there were particular places or particular types of places where you were more likely to have an encounter with a ghost, or in the days when they believed in such things with the fairies, with witches. And these places are what is now fashionably referred to as liminal places. And liminality is just, it really usually refers to a border. So the Avinsue River ticks that box because it was close to the border between Lewis and Harris. Boundaries between villages, boundaries between neighbouring estates, the banks of rivers, the banks of lochs, anything like that, these kind of geographical features, even where the landscape changes, where the moor gives way to Macher, These are liminal places, and it was believed, maybe it's still believed by some people, that you were more likely to have a supernatural encounter in one of these kinds of places. Liminality also applies to time, and that's why Samhain, our modern Halloween, when that was marked as a fire festival by our forefathers, it really marked the end of the pastoral year and the beginning of the next. And the Celts were great believers in continuity. And they believed that this breach in the continuity of time created a gateway through which the other world could come into this one. And that's why Halloween has its spooky reputation. It wasn't a festival for glorifying the occult. It was really a harvest festival, but because of its liminality, the fact that it marked the end of one year and the beginning of the next, it was a corridor for the other world. And it can apply in your own life as well, because every life is finite, life has a beginning and an end, and that's why you hear lots of supernatural accounts relating especially to newborns, and all these measures that used to be taken to protect newborn babies and their mothers, probably to a lesser extent. They were protected from fairies and witches and so on, because they were at the beginning of life and they were in that danger zone. Equally, at the end of life, people sitting up with the remains, it had to do with this idea that the beginning and the end of things is a time when there might be supernatural attack. So that's the Tanask, and that's the fairly well understood. That's what we would normally just label Taoiseach. The Tanask was the ghost of the dead. If you've got to have a word for a ghost of the dead, if you've got to be that specific, it implies that there must have been a ghost of the living, and indeed there was. We use a word a lot these days, a German word, doppelganger. You might say to someone, I saw your doppelganger, your absolute double today. But doppelganger means double walker. And in Scots, they have the co-walker. And in Gaelic, we have or had the tavisk. Now, it might be a word some of you are familiar with. I certainly heard it growing up, but I heard it not being used in its proper way. My father used to use it as an insult for people. And it always meant someone who was a bit wishy-washy, ineffectual. And it's a really good use of the word in a way, because it's quite close to its original meaning in one sense. Tavisk was this idea that some people had a physical alter ego, an exact double of themselves, like a hologram, that sort of idea, that can go out and about, unknown to the person, and do things and say things and behave in a way that perhaps the person wouldn't particularly approve of. There's quite a lot of accounts of people's tafiskin, for instance, beating up friends, or giving people a hard time. Write this down. It might be something you can use as an alibi if you need to. There are numerous stories, especially young men. It seems to be a lot of stories about young men who would get into a fight with their friend's tafisk. There were rules around the tafisk as well, or it would seem like there were rules around it, in that if you met someone else's tafisk, it could speak to you, but it was mostly unintelligible. It was mumbling, inaudible, and even where it was audible, you couldn't really make a lot of sense of most of what it was saying until you spoke to it. If you spoke to it, once you engaged it in conversation, which people reputedly did innocently, thinking it was the actual person they were talking to, and probably the opening question quite often would be, what are you doing here? Once you did that, not only could it speak to you, but there's quite a number of stories of people then being absolutely plagued by their friend or their relative's tavisk, and being forced to go and meet it at the same time every day, being forced to actually have conversation with it. And was said as well that if the Tavis came calling for you, if someone's Tavis came to your house and you'd gone to bed or whatever, and you thought, not that Tavis again, I don't want to get involved, if you ignored it, the next time you met it, you would get an absolute thrashing, a physical beating up. What that relates to, it's difficult to say. Sometimes it seems as though it was maybe revealing people's true feelings, perhaps. There's a lot of stories about Taviscan in terms of romantic relationships, or not relationships, but romantic longing. There's a story that the Reverend John Gregerson Campbell, who collected a lot of supernatural folklore in Mull, he tells one about a boy who worked as, I think, a gardener or something like that in a big house in Mull. And one of the maidservants took a bit of a notion for him, and she made him some gloves and made him a present of these gloves, which he accepted. And he set off that same day to visit his parents, and it was a day's walk away. So he went off to visit the parents, and when he was about halfway, he came to this fairly lonely and treacherous part of the walk. It was a bit of a hill path. And he noticed, just on the path above him, there was the maidservant, the one who had given him the gloves. And he thought, that can't be, because she would have to have overtaken me. I left her at the house. There's no other way for her to have gone. And for her to be ahead of me, she would have had to pass me. So he knew there was something not natural about it. He also knew that where she was, if he drew level with her and she wanted to give him a shove, that would be it for him. He was going to plummet onto some rocks below, and that would be the end of him. So he briefly considered what he would do, and then he just uttered a wee prayer under his breath, and he put his head down and went for it. And he did have a bit of a physical tussle with her, but he got past her. And when he was safely past her, he pulled the gloves off. He was wearing the gloves she had given him, and he chucked the gloves at her. And he said, "That's all the business you're ever going to have with me." And he carried on to his parents' house. Of course, he had to come back that way later that night. I'm sure he was looking forward to it. And when he came back, he saw that the gloves were on the ground where he had thrown them, which just went to prove his original thought that she wasn't really present. She wasn't actually physically there at all. It was her Tavisk. But it's amazing how often these stories relate to jealousy and to vindictive behaviour. Even the ones where it's apparently someone's friend whose Tavisk has appeared, it quite often ends badly, or it comes to unpleasantness. And I can't help wondering if it's not in some way related to the ideas that we have in our dólachas about the evil eye as well, the evil eye being very much powered by envy. I think the two things are probably a little bit related. These are the two sort of the main types of what we would call ghosts. They weren't always going to be seen with the eye, though. Those examples that I've given you are ghosts that people were seeing, and people would report. People could describe what they looked like, and they could tell you that they saw them in such and such a place, and that they resembled this person or that person. And it was possible sometimes even to identify whose ghost it might be. But there were other ghosts, if we're going to keep on using that sort of generic term. There was a belief that people could manifest their longing to be somewhere through noise. I haven't explained that very well. So for example, if you're at home and a relative of yours really wishes that they could come and visit you, you might hear the rattling of the door latch, you might hear their familiar footsteps on the path, you might catch a glimpse of them. But it's as if their longing, and this relates back to what I was saying before about just the power of feeling, whether it's envy or negative emotions, or if it's this positive idea of longing to be somewhere. It was believed that they could physically, or that their longing could create a sort of a physical manifestation, and that that sound or that vision or that rattling at the door, that was known as taslich. So we've had taish, we've had tafisk, and now we've got taslich. Taslich is the foreshadowing of somebody coming to the house, or even somebody just wanting to come to the house or to wherever you are, and it's mostly auditory. It's mostly these stories that talk about, oh, I heard footsteps, or I caught a glimpse. And I heard a story recently, very recently, from somebody who had 2 great aunties, I think it was. During the Second World War, they had a nephew who was away in the Navy, and one day they were just pottering about the kitchen, and they heard the gate, which caused one of them to look at the window, and to her surprise, here was the nephew, complete in uniform and everything, coming up the path. And he passed the window, but he didn't come to the door. And she thought, oh, that doesn't, like the old people, I'm sure a lot of you heard the old people saying drochhonger. It seemed like everything was a drochhonger. She took it as a bad sign. And he did, in fact, lose his life. I don't think it was immediately after that. I think it was a little while after that. And skeptics might say, well, he was engaged in active combat, so the likelihood of that happening was quite high anyway. But he did lose his life, and the 2 women, the 2 aunties, moved out of the house. They didn't want to have anything else to do with it. It was as if they associated what they had seen and what happened with the place they were in. Now, what I don't know in that case is whether they were given to seeing things, because you can hear sometimes stories of people who saw something like that, or who had that kind of experience once, and you wouldn't actually say, oh, that person had the second sight, or, you know, in that sort of habitual ongoing way. But it seems as though it was given to people sometimes to see certain things at certain times, and it seemed to be under particular duress as well. But that's taslich, another word that you'll hear it sometimes shorter. You'll hear people saying taslich and taslich. It's talking about the same thing. Not to be confused with the other types of I suppose auditory haunting. I suppose that is the right term. You hear of people sometimes talking about knocking that they've heard, or a particular kind of sound, perhaps at home or somewhere else. And that is then associated in their minds with an event that occurs. And I'm thinking here of 1 or 2 stories that I'm familiar with. One from Ug, concerns a young man. He was 27, I think, or thereabouts, and he just dropped dead on the croft. This would have been the early part of the 20th century, just dropped dead on the family croft. And of course, there was panic, because initially they couldn't be sure that he had died. Picked him up and carried him into the house, and upstairs to his room, and a doctor was sent for, and so on. And there was an elderly granny, bedridden, in one of the downstairs rooms. And when it was sadly established that the young man had died, one of the family went into the Gaelic to tell her, and she said, she said, she said, you don't need to tell me. Long since I heard the clatter, the noise of your feet on the stairs. She didn't mean when they had come in. She meant she had heard it sometime before that, and knew something, if not what exactly, she knew something was going to occur. There are other ones in a similar kind of vein that you'll hear, relating to people hearing psalm singing just sudden outbursts of psalm singing. There's one, and I can never quite pin it down to a place. I've heard it attributed to Lochs and to various other places. Maybe some of you are familiar with it. A man who was walking home one evening, and just suddenly there was this upswell of psalm singing. So he stood where he was and took his hat off, which was almost certainly not what I would have done, but anyway he did, and he stood his ground, took his hat respectfully off, waited till the singing had finished, and then put his hat on and went on his way. And seemingly some relatively short time after that, a church was built in the vicinity. Similar, but also not similar, is a story about a man from, well, I won't say where he was from. He was a fisherman, and from this island. He was a fisherman, and he was out in his boat, out at sea, and he, again, had that similar experience. He heard Psalm 23 being sung in Gaelic, and obviously no discernible source for it. He actually went and checked his radio. This would have been something like the 60s, I think, 60s or 70s. Went and checked his radio, and wasn't the radio. And by the time he got back to land, he was in such a terror about it that he actually, the doctor had to be sent for, and he had to be sedated. But he was adamant afterwards that he'd had that experience, and that there was absolutely no explanation for it. He was, needless to say, you know the pattern of these kinds of accounts. His life had been a bit, probably not anything excessive, but he liked a dram, and he wasn't much of a churchgoer, but all of that changed for him quite soon afterwards. These kinds of stories are typically, and I'm not in any way, I'm not being skeptical here, but typically people, when they hear something and then an event happens, that's when the matching occurs. It's not, not when you get the knock at the door, and you go and there's nobody there, and you say, oh well, I'm going to get bad news. It's when the bad news comes, you retrospectively match the two things. And I'm not dismissing it, because the one thing that's very true about all of these kinds of things is they're people's experiences. People report having these experiences. Very often it's totally trustworthy people who reported having them. You have no other reason to doubt their veracity, so why start questioning them on this? But the ability to discern what was going to happen in the future seemed to fall on some people more than others. There were definitely people who saw as well as just heard. There were lots of people in this island who, for instance, would see funerals. They've come to be known as phantom funerals. But I know there was a man from Carloway who, one evening, he was actually walking home with a friend. A lot of the stories seem to run along those lines. And the friend thought he was having a turn, because the man suddenly started, he was puffing and panting. They were walking on a flat bit of road, puffing and panting, pouring sweat. And the friend, while he was looking at him and thinking, is he having some sort of turn, he also was aware of the man's reputation as a bit of a seer. And he just sort of watched this happening, and then eventually the sort of struggle abated. And he sort of wiped his brow, and he said to his companion, oh, well, was it traum? That was heavy. The man said to him, what are you talking about? He had not only seen a funeral, but he had been pushed by an unseen force. He had been carried into the procession and forced to take a lift along with the others. And of course his friend was oblivious, because it's mostly believed that the seer can't show the non-seer what he's looking at. Some people believed that they could, and that there was a way of doing it, that if I was with a seer and he was looking at an actual vision, that if I put my left hand and my left foot on his left shoulder and his left foot, that I would be able, looking across his shoulder, I'd be able to see it too. And people also believed, opinions divided on that even, some believed that it was a permanent transference. Not that the original seer got rid of the gift, he still retained it, but that the other person would also have it from there on in. And others believed that no, it was a one-time only of her, and that he could see the thing once, but not in any ongoing way. Generally speaking, it's not something that people would find particularly desirable anyway. So there were people who were hearing things that foreshadowed, there were people who were seeing things, and there were definitely people who couldn't explain where their knowledge came from. One evening after doing a talk like this over in Lochs, a lady came to speak to me afterwards, and she said, I knew who she was, and she's only a few years older than myself. She said that she said that I used to see things as well. And I was interested by the fact that she said used to. And she went on and she told me a couple of things that had happened, one in particular. And she was talking really about her childhood when she was about 6 or 7. And she was a pupil in that great seat of learning, Lagsdale School, that I'm also a graduate of. And one day their itinerant, I think it was a music teacher, didn't turn up. Just didn't turn up, and nobody seemed to know what had happened. And she was passing 2 or 3 of the teachers talking in the corridor, and she overheard their conversation, just a snippet as she was passing. And one of them was saying to the other, "Oh, I wonder what happened to Mr. Let's call him Mr. MacDonald, I don't know what his name was. I wonder what happened to Mr. MacDonald." And as she was passing, she said, "I heard myself saying, 'Poor Mr. MacDonald, he died.'" And then, of course, she got a row from the teachers for saying things out of turn. She didn't know, how could she possibly know what an awful thing to be saying. But sure enough, as this would have been the late 70s, news took maybe a little bit longer to filter out then. By that evening or by the next day, the news had gone round that he had in fact died suddenly, and that's obviously why he wasn't in school that day. And the other examples she gave me, a lot of them related to her own family. Knowing when people far away were ill, knowing they shouldn't take a journey, this kind of thing. But she couldn't explain how she'd come by the knowledge. And she said, quite often I would just hear myself say things. I would offer the advice or the insight, but I don't know where it came from. And then I asked her, I said, "You're speaking in the past tense." I said, do you not see things anymore, or do you not receive knowledge anymore? And she laughed and she said, "No, it stopped when I got married." Like so many other things, it stopped. And what was it Basil Fawlty used to say? That's another avenue of pleasure cut off to me. That was an interesting example, I think, of someone who herself couldn't articulate how the knowledge came to her. So one final story that I always like to share, it's my own favourite example of second sight, of a local instance of second sight. And by local I mean island. There was a family in Carloway in Doon who were known to, quite often the second sight was said to run in families, and they were reputed to be a family of seers. But they were also known to be really gifted bards. There's some people think that the two things historically went hand in hand. I know that the late Dr. John McInnes of the School of Scottish Studies sort of thought along those lines, that go back to clan times, that the filly, the high-ranking bards, that at one time part of their vocation was to be the prognosticator, the seer for the clan as well. But that's kind of speculative. This family were reputed to have those two gifts. And there was one of them living in Doon, and he was known, they were known as Nasydd, and he was Anthu in Hydd. And I think by the time this occurred, he was reasonably well on in years. He wasn't a young man. And it was a Sunday afternoon, and he'd had his Sunday dinner. So, like all sensible body of that era, and probably this one, he decided to go for a lie down. And he went through to the bedroom, and he took off his boots, and he put his boots against the edge of the door, I think, to hold the door open. And he lay down on the bed, and he hadn't been lying down on the bed very long when he heard his boots being moved been sort of just, not just moved, but somebody messing about with them, scuffing them about. And there were kids in the house, presumably his grandkids, I think, by that point. So, of course, he assumed it was them. And without even lifting his head from the pillow, he said, "Fuck my vrogan." He didn't expect a reply, but he got one. He got a reply, and I'll tell you it in Gaelic and then I'll tell you it in English. A voice, he maintained, replied to him and said, "Fuck mi UHI agus de vrogan, ach is de luchiolish nimi tel. Gulik gorst de garden, mahurus jamarst gan valisho." So let me see. No, that's a lot more poetic than my translation is going to be. He said, the voice said, "I will leave you and your shoes, but I will visit your acquaintances. Your relatives will bitterly weep my visit on Tuesday to this village." I like that specific information at the end there, that it was going to be on Tuesday. That's about as specific a prognostication as you were ever likely to hear. Now, that one I can verify, though it was my father that passed that one on to me, and he could never remember whether it was Anthu's brother's wife or his cousin's wife. But in either case, a female relative died the following Tuesday. Not a tragic death, an elderly, probably semi-expected death, but nonetheless accurate. The fact that the family were reputed to be good poets as well as seers makes you wonder about the verse. Was it his own inner voice speaking to him? Not, I think, that robs it of any of its mystery, because you still then have that question, well, where did his inner voice obtain the knowledge from? It wasn't even knowledge, it was certainty. And of course there's the possibility that he polished up the verse every time he told it, and maybe the first time he told it, it wasn't quite as finished as that. But it's one of those curiosities of local second sight that I think tells me that there's a whole wealth of stuff still out there that hasn't been recorded, that hasn't been written down. And it's important to have evenings like this, I think, just to reawaken people's memories. People immediately think, oh, that reminds me of something I heard when I was young, or something I heard last year, or whenever it was. And that we air them and we share them. And yes, I think it's important that we collect them and publish them and things like that. But more importantly, they were meant to be spoken, they were meant to be shared, and I think that's the way forward initially. And I think, more evenings like this with people actually sharing, not the likes of me standing up here pontificating, but people actually telling what they remember and what they know. I think that's where we need to go from here with it. Thank you.
There's probably some time if anyone wants to ask any questions or share.
Share, yes, that would be good.
Share with us any of your own experiences or stories.
I hope nobody's walking home alone.
I was particularly the auditory portents. I was finding interesting. I remember my father saying his mother used to tell him that the sound of rattling stones, like the pebbles in poured concrete, she would use that terminology, and running water together would be a portent of death, and so it was on some occasions. So it is fascinating, and I'm sure we all are.
I think we've lost a lot of that. There probably was specific knowledge around those things, and there's sort of wee snippets of it collected by the likes of Alexander Carmichael and people like that, but you can't get a complete picture. It's a wee bit like watching a forensics person working with tiny little, or an archaeologist, tiny little fragments, and we don't know how it all fitted together, which is frustrating.
And my father sitting with me in the glen in Call and talking about the fairies He was born in 1915. And he wasn't a fanciful man, really. He was speaking very seriously to me about the fields. Which is, the river you were talking about.
It's interesting what you say about the seer and the bard. It's not something, but well, I know for a fact my cousin of ours was a very good bard, but she also used to read the tea leaves for people before they went away.
Right.
And did, well, certainly on one occasion, sort of foretold my own uncle's death. One uncle was going away, and he went up from Gaelic, and she looked and she wasn't very keen. And then she more or less said, well, going away, take your suit and your black tie, because you'll be coming back. And he got as far as Kyle and my father's brother, the other uncle, who fell into the hatch of the ship, and his brother came home with the body.
And that was from the teacup. That's quite unusual. You don't hear a lot of that. I think people were probably doing it more than they talked about it, if you know what I mean.
I'm surprised that you didn't relate any of the stories to your own place, Tolstoy.
Nisha, I think a disclaimer was issued at the beginning that I'm not from there.
It was one of those tales that were always good. That the Glen was haunted. There's many incidents of people seeing things in the Glen, and that goes back to what you were saying about the boundary issue. That,
yes,
whatever it was. And one specific person you saw, now whether this was because it was 2 sheets to the wind is another thing. I dare say,
or more than 2.
Correct.
Oh, probably more than 2.
Old correct. Because there was many stories going around then when we were growing up about what he had seen, and it was specifically in the Glen before the new road up.
Donald Red was very superstitious. I do know, not that I remember him, but I've heard stories of him going to buy rams and bringing his. I don't know how superstitious he was. He maybe hoped other people were. He'd have his rabbit's foot with him, and if they didn't strike the deal that he wanted, he would say, "All right, well, we'll see what happens." Rabbit foot would go back in the. Aye, that's probably not been superstitious. Just been a businessman.
Were spirits intrinsically evil, regarded as evil? Because we don't hear much about good spirits, do we? Or do we?
Spirits as distinct from ghosts or
spirits, no ghosts.
See, because for something like this, you have to sort of talk as if there are rules, but a lot of it is blurry and grey. No, I think some of them, those ones who came back with a message, for example, I think they were regarded as being, at worst, neutral. And I mean, there's stories. Frank Thompson used to have one about, I think it was in Skye, about a woman who was left destitute when she was widowed. Doesn't happen to many people. Her husband was drowned and she was left with a young family. And one night the husband appeared and he came over to the fireplace and he tapped one of the stones on the fireplace. And then he went. And after she sort of recovered herself, she went over to examine the place that he had been tapping, and it was a loose stone, pulled it out. He had been saving money for the family and he had stashed it there unknown to her, and he had come back to. So there's instances like that where obviously they didn't signify anything bad. But I think the whole relationship with the other world was so sketchy. I think, like for instance, the man I mentioned who was seeing the funerals, the one who was forced into, he took to carrying a Bible in his pocket. Now I don't know if that was just sheer desperation because he didn't want to be seeing these things, or did he actually believe that what he was seeing came from a bad place? It's difficult to know.
It's a coincidence that most of these issues were around death. Almost 99% of them were around death.
Yeah, I remember as a kid, I used to say quite scathingly sometimes to my father and to the old people, I would say, why was it always, you know, could they not for once see something?
Something bad going on.
But you know, I think death preoccupied people for a reason more than it does now, because death was, I mean, death now is as obviously as emotionally devastating as it ever was, but it was more practically devastating then. So, the likes of that young woman I mentioned who was left with a family, no means to support herself. It must have been a big fear in their lives. You know, if you had a husband who was a fisherman or a sailor, plus there was disease as well, everything was much more dangerous, and it must have been an ever-present fear that you might be left in that situation. On the converse as well, that if a man was left with a young family, if left as a widower, you only have to look at the records or ask the likes of Bill Lawson, and he'll tell you about all the second marriages, which were really just, they were transactional. They weren't. There's one, I remember him talking about a man from Harris, I think it was, who actually married his second wife on the day of the first wife's funeral. The same minister performed the two services. And it was just, people been what I know, Herachs are just, they're not like other people. That's what it is.
Talking about what Anna was saying earlier on, we had a teacher in Nicholson on Hamish from Aird Point, and she taught us a lot about things which we don't hear about, the fairies and all this. We had a play called She, you know, can remind you. And I was the head of the fairies, in the play.
Typecasting.
I was the chief fairy.
We'll quote you on that.
But the thing about it was, she was actually, we were, you know, getting taught a lot about these things that people did believe in. People genuinely did believe in these spirits and fairies and this kind of that we have forgotten about. And I remember asking a man in South Hughes once in Hughes House, you know, I was recording some story he had about, you know, sights that he was seeing, and I said, why don't we see these sights nowadays? He says, because we're going past everything, you know, at speed. You know, people, you know, when they were walking, they were aware of what was around them, and nowadays we're not aware. Maybe these things are still there, but we're not aware of them.
I think that's, and we're not connected with each other the way we used to, the way they were. I mean, people then, your community was as close as closer than some families are now, and people knew each other's business, and I don't mean that even in an intrusive way. They were aware and they were concerned for one another in a way that, you know, it just isn't going to happen now. But as you say, we live life at a rate, well, some people live life at a rate or not, and there's just not that awareness, and we're not connected to the landscape in the way we used to be. People aren't working the land in the way they used to be. They're not going out into the moor the way they used to be. So it's the change is bound to come, but I think it's really obvious through the language. I mean, a lot of that vocabulary probably isn't familiar to people in the normal run of things, and yet once upon a time people would have used it very easily because they talked about these things so much, and they had to have a more nuanced way of talking about the different sorts of things that they were seeing and experiencing. And we wouldn't know even how to use some of that vocabulary now, so it's meaningless.
I think the other comment you made about it running in families is, you know, very clear example that you used of MacLean from Duncarley facilities. I could give you about 6. In fact, I was telling was one of them before he came in here just now. They're the same, they're my own folk. So it's gone into the Harris side, it's gone into the UHI side and the Carley side. And there's examples from every strand of the family, whether she or slightly or not.
Creepy in other ways, probably.
You've had a sword, and the fairy host being taken away and somebody landed somewhere else. Have you heard of instances where people have experienced that in Lewis? Or is there a name for it now?
No.
Will they use swag in places like Lewis? Do they have the same sort of experiences?
Do you know when I said at the beginning that I had picked this talk because it was there's so much on this. It's like a sliding scale. I suppose if you then said, well, what next? What's the next most prevalent thing, you would probably say either the evil eye or buisneach, and the two things, there's a wee bit of a blur there anyway. And fairies are right down there at the bottom of what we still have left, you know, what we've, because there's that huge long period where Lewis was neglected. Lewis and Harris and North Eust were neglected because people just thought, oh well, prostanich, they're not going to have hang on. You know, the Free Church did away with the fairies and all of that sort of thing. And to an extent, it's been a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the people who did have that knowledge, or that, you know, the memory of these things, they didn't get recorded, it didn't get preserved, so a lot of it's been lost. And it's really only survives in things like the, you know, you mentioned Knockney, and there's places where they have, I know in Naas and Skiggerstad, they've got Clach, is it Clach na Gruakish, do you know, Norman? Is it Skiggerstad? I'm sure there's a Clach na Gruakish where they used to leave out offerings for the fairy, an offering of milk, yeah.
Gruagach was kind to those.
The Gruagach was kind. The Gruagach used to hang around cattle folds and sheep folds, and as long as you gave her a drink of milk, she would look after
I was
the...
going to ask you about the abbey and people went out into the moors. Is there a lot of any stories you come across where people were seeing things out in the abbey or logs? Or?
Well, of course, the famous one is Loch Addy na Hynny, which has versions from all over this island and even the mainland highlands. And yes, lots of these kinds of stories. And I think it was easy for people to write it off as, oh, you know, they were in a different environment, or the wind made a different sound round the Addy to what they were used to. And, you know, it largely been a community of women and kids, and that they were just frightened. But no, there were numerous stories there of them seeing people, hearing noises, and having, you know, these kinds of auditory premonitions. Lots and lots of those.
There are a lot of stories.
Quite well, I would say a lot that I personally have heard. Not written down, not hugely accessible. But I mean, going back to your previous question about the Slóig, I think most of what we know about that comes from further south, and it's not to say that people here didn't believe in it, but it's just not on record. There's a story from Point, there would be, wouldn't there, about a baby that was born with, he's described as having been born with the skin of an old man. And of course, as people used to do, he was just hidden away. And somebody came to stay with the family, and he told them what they should do to help the child. And he asked, is there a Knockney han Fashke, was there a fairy hill nearby? And they said yes. So he said, go there, dig 2 small graves side by side, leave a channel ye big in between. Call one the grave of the living and the other the grave of the dead. Place the baby on the channel, and he's going to wriggle about, and he's going to land in one or the other. And that'll predict the course of his life and what will happen to him. Luckily, he fell into the grave of the living, and his condition cleared up, and he lived a normal life. Now, it's not reported what might have happened had he gone the other way, or what the connection with the fairies is. Because normally the connection with the fairies is that they take babies, not that they... But then they weren't taking them for any malicious reason. They were taking them because they coveted them, like, because they were beautiful, and they wanted to own them like pets. They never meant them any harm, so it's maybe an extension of that. But that's the only, in terms of the School of Scottish Studies archive, that's the only fairy story relating to this island that I'm aware of.
Why were people here so reluctant to talk about these matters, really? But because they were, I remember recording one of the pod with some of these things, and I asked if your daughter recorded a lot of rubbish, you know, and I checked one of the things out, and it was actually right. But people didn't want to talk about these things.
Well, if you couldn't get them to talk about them, I don't know. I think a variety of things. I mean, in all seriousness, the church did have a little bit to do with it. I think this idea of Davis Dynja Gra, Davis Dynja Smunja, you know, that you didn't want to be fun, you didn't want to be thought of as someone who was taken up with these things. I think as well there was that superstition that the more you talked about something, you were sort of gavrosnachig, and you were maybe kind of going to bring it on yourself or on somebody else. And it was like they were averting their eyes from it, while still on some level definitely believing that it was there, but just let's not acknowledge it and let's not talk about it. And the great irony is that a lot of the stuff that was collected by ministers. So there were some great minister folklorists, not least the one I mentioned, John Gregerson Campbell. And if you're looking for a good book to read over the winter, The Gaelic Otherworld, edited by Ronald Black, but it's a collection of John Gregerson Campbell's works, and it's really readable. It's not, it's academically rigorous, as they say, but it's a really readable book. And don't be put off by its size either. It's really, really good read, and you've got nothing better to do with this rain and the darkness. That's how to spend the next couple of months.
Could you say a cup of tea?
Yes.
A cup of tea would be spot on.
Well, I've been asked to propose a vote of thanks, and I do so without any great difficulty, but with a bit of reputation. And I find this so unusual because I don't think I've ever talked to you in English.
No, I don't suppose you have.
Can I, on behalf of Monette, thank you sincerely for coming out tonight and for giving us an interesting talk, and for opening out a subject that could do with more discussion and more open discussion and discussion without fear or favour. And thank you very much indeed on behalf of the Monette.
Thank you, my pleasure.